Hello Government B students, this is Mrs. Miller. I am doing this video to let you have a Unit 2 test review. And before I start, I want to just kind of make a disclaimer. Please be sure to make that you read all of the questions thoroughly, including the answers as well as the questions, just so you don't get tricked by any oddly worded questions, okay? So that's something I want to make sure you all do, because that happens in all of my classes. And I hit down, but it didn't go to the next slide. Let me click it. Okay, there we go. So the first I'm going to talk about some federal agencies. Federal agencies can be anything under the federal government, and they can report to any and all branches of the government. So there are some agencies that report to executive, some that report to legislative, and some that report to judicial. And so that's just something to keep in mind with the agencies, that they can report to different branches or even all of the branches. Federal agencies often implement policy, and the number of executive departments have grown throughout history because of the increased workload as the country has grown. Just as different aspects of government and presidential power has grown throughout throughout our history, agencies grow to help handle some of that workload. Let's see, and then sunset provisions make sure that an agency is achieving its goals before it gets further funding. So those are just some of the ways that that the agencies have checks and balances kind of within themselves and within the people who supervise them, to make sure that they maintain their positive movement. If they are stuck in a rut and not doing anything, then the agency would not get its funding for the next year. Presidential succession. This is one that I wish I could go into just all of the stuff with this in one lesson, and I may one day. But for your test review, some of the things you want to know is the fact that the vice president succeeds the president in the event that the president can no longer lead is determined by the Constitution. So vice presidential succession into the office of president is determined by the Constitution. And the fact that the Speaker of the House is next in line of presidential succession is determined by the Presidential Succession Act. And that came later. The Constitution, of course, came first, and the Presidential Succession Act came later. Actually, I'm going to go back up for just a second. The fact that the vice president does not only become president if the president dies. Say the president has a heart attack and or a stroke or something, and is unable to lead, but eventually will come back. The vice president would step into those shoes. So yeah. Presidential appointments. Andrew Jackson used the spoils system to reward his friends and supporters. The spoils system is giving offices and government favors to people you want to reward. Usually people who are your buddies or people who got you votes, or it's just another type of nepotism or cronyism. It's putting people who into positions that will do what you want, and it's to reward them as well. One problem with the spoils system is there's massive turnover with every new president. So every time a president switched offices, they'd fire just hundreds of people and place hundreds of people. And the problem with that is once any agency really gets moving well, if you fire everybody who works there, it's going to take another couple years for people to figure out what the heck they're doing. So that's a reason why the Pendleton Act is really important. So yeah, one problem with the spoils system is there was massive turnover with each new president, and each president would enter office and replace huge amounts of people. The Pendleton Act put reform into place for civil service, and it made it so people had to earn their spots, not just because the president thought they were a good dude. The civil service positions have a policy in place to make sure that federal employees are promoted due to merit, not nepotism. Presidential appointments. Usually, the president appoints from within his or her own political party. It is unusual for a president to appoint someone from an opposite party, but it's not completely unheard of. Especially like with the first cabinet, Washington had people from all sorts of views because he wanted various opinions in his inner circle to help him govern the country correctly. So that's pretty admirable. Members of the cabinet, as well as other presidential appointees, must be approved by the Senate. These people have a lot of power, and to just have them be somebody put in there and not be approved would be a mistake. So they are approved by the Senate. Cabinet departments report directly to the president. Presidential elections. The public votes on party candidates and primaries, which we just had our Republican primary last week. Of course, you guys probably aren't watching this when I'm filming it, but yeah, we just had our Republican primary for president. And then in 2 weeks, we're going to have our Democratic caucus for president for the primaries. The nominees are ultimately selected by the state delegates. So the delegates that are won through the primary process are the people who select the candidates or the nominees. Presidential candidates must be at least 35 years old, a natural born citizen of the United States, and must have lived in the U.S. for at least 14 years. Presidential candidates do not have to have I love typos. Do not have to have political experience. As we can see from candidates from recent years, there are many candidates, both in this election cycle and in previous election cycles, who are running because they don't have political experience. People think that because they're an outsider, they have a different perspective on government and won't be as political, won't be as necessarily diplomatic, and just go in and shake things up. So people can view not having political experience as a positive or a negative. Presidential elections continued. The framers of the Constitution decided that they couldn't entirely trust the populace, so they set up the Electoral College to elect the president. The framers thought that Congress would have been too powerful if they chose the president, which is, I agree, I think that's very smart, and they believed that it would offset the separation of powers. So they wanted the people to elect the president, but not the common man. The common man goes out and does the public vote, but then our vote is given to our electoral college, and the electoral college is how it goes one way or the other. And that's why there have been a few cases in history where the electoral college and the popular vote do not line up, and people get really upset about it. So the framers thought Congress would have been too powerful if they chose the president, and they believed that would offset the separation of powers, which I said already, but still. Candidates for the presidency try to balance their tickets with a vice president or a running mate that have slightly different views or records. So if a presidential nominee is seen as someone who is, I'm trying to think of if he or she might be seen as someone who didn't have strict issues about guns, then one way or the other, then they might have a running mate who does have opposite views to help balance the ticket and get people to vote for them because of the vice president running candidate. That's what I'm looking for. The vice president's views, because people want to know that the president has someone next to him or her that's going to tell them something slightly different from what is already in his or her head. Presidential power. Many things have altered the strength of presidential power. Economic events, catastrophic events. Economic events like the Depression have really changed presidential power. FDR had a lot more power than other presidents because he needed it. He needed to step up and help the country. And hold on just a second. I had to take a drink before I coughed. After catastrophic events, after 9/11, the president had a lot more power, and Congress went with it. They gave the president a lot more power than he had before, and with things like things like the Patriot Act went through, and yes, that isn't necessarily presidential, but the president helped push it through. System of checks and balances has not strengthened presidential power. It has helped limit it. The checks and balance help keep it from getting too out of hand during times when we are more led by emotions than by reason, like during the Great Depression or after 9/11. Expressed presidential power comes in two categories: constitutional and delegated. Presidential duties. The purpose of the executive office of the president is to help the president carry out his or her duties as the chief executive. So that means the offices around the president, not the president's office, like the Oval Office, but the people who work under the president to get things done. Upon receiving a bill, the president has a duty to do a few things. He I'm just going to say he, because at this point we haven't had a female president. He can veto the bill. He can decide not to sign the bill, which has two outcomes depending on what's going on with Congress. The first is if Congress is in session and he doesn't sign the bill, after 10 days it becomes law. If they are out of session and he doesn't sign the bill, then it's considered a pocket veto, and he's vetoed it without actually saying veto. It's kind of a passive way of doing it. Or he signs the bill to make it a law. The president cannot send the bill back for revisions. It's already been revised through different committee meetings and different things on the floor of Congress. The public's perception of the role of president was altered by the stewardship theory put forth by Theodore Roosevelt. So that's an important one to remember as well. Sorry, that was my water bottle again. And the essay question, this is my last slide. Yeah, that's the last one. Essay question: both the federal bureaucracy and the presidency expanded and changed during the 20th century. In an essay of 125 words or more, first describe how the bureaucracy changed and expanded during that time, and second, explain the connection, if any, that this change had with the expansion of federal power. So one way you can kind of look at that is the different offices created under FDR's administration. That would be one way you can look at it, and there are plenty of others as well. But yeah, that's it. I hope you guys found this helpful. Please give me a call when you finish watching it if you are using this for your live class. And I look forward to talking to you, and I wish you good luck on your test.